Welcome to those of you who are joining on Zoom and perhaps later on YouTube. Just want to acknowledge that we did figure out that the PDF for today's class isn't yet up on the website. It will be soon. I've already sort of texted the appropriate people, so hopefully it won't be too long until that piece is there as well, so that you can fully participate. So this is the fourth of 6 classes, Transcending Contempt, and the goal of each class has been to land on a gerund. And a gerund is a verb that ends in ing, and I'm doing that deliberately because each of these gerunds indicates a practice that I hope isn't something that's a one-off, but that something that becomes an ongoing part of your life, part of our lives. So the first one was practicing, wag, wonder, attention, gratitude, and the goal is to have those things be woven in our lives and just part of how we approach the world. The next one was nurturing magnanimity, great-heartedness. And again, the idea is to develop a strong heart that is neither a Grinch heart, tight and greedy, or a puffed-up heart, too big for its own britches, but one that's right-sized and generous, and a heart that unites us as whole human beings so that we're not all in our head or all operating out of our guts, but the heart as a way to unite who we are as a whole human, loving human being. And then last week's practice, stewarding our halo, which we just reflected on in some very meaningful ways, as a way of understanding who we are as a unique human being and not get swallowed up by that monstrous abstraction, the public, but really be who we are in the moment, bearing in mind and in our hearts where we've come from, our grandparents, our parents, our family and friends, ongoing relationship with them, and with a real hope for the future. So that's where we've come so far. Now, class number 4, if you'll go to the second page of the handout, you can fill out the practice number 4, which is loving ourselves. Now, as you fill out the gerund, the whole phrase for our practice, loving ourselves, see which one of you can look at practice number 5 and figure out what practice number 5 is going to be. Anyone? Yes, Francis?
Loving our neighbor.
Yes, that's exactly right. So that's next week. But this week, first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So we're going to focus on loving ourselves. How? By being good rather than evil. So loving ourselves is being somebody who has good practices and is good in the world. How do we do that? Well, the words we're going to use are very good, privation, repetition, habits, and the preternatural. Now, I keep bringing us back to this idea of Thomas's cosmos. As you may remember, in the first class, I invited us to primarily inhabit Thomas's cosmos, and less Carl Sagan's universe. I, Carl Sagan, am this collection of atoms called Carl Sagan, or of what we could call Steve Jobs' metaverse. You may remember I had that experience of the first time I held an iPhone and felt like it was a Dementor in the Harry Potter movies where it was sucking my soul into it. Thomas's cosmos picks up on a teaching from the very beginning of Genesis where it says, after the 6th day of creation, God looked at all that God had created and he saw that it was very good. The invitation is to live in gratitude, which I believe is the appropriate Christian stance to all of creation being a very good gift from God. This can contrast to some understandings of Buddhism, for example, where part of what we're trying to nurture is a sort of indifference to creation. That's not the Christian stance. Or to some variations on Christianity or challenges to it, which are still around, these understandings that what's truly good is the spiritual world, and we just need to get beyond the material world to what is truly good, which is the spiritual. That's not the Christian take either. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. God looked at all that God had created, and saw that it was very good. It is all good. There's a wonderful prayer in the Book of Common Prayer that starts off, "O God, you hate nothing you have made." That's our view on reality. Evil, then, is privation. It is hollowing out the natural fullness of things. In the prelude to John's Gospel, it says, "From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." Evil, because all it does is hollow out, has no shape or form other than the shape or form that it is in the process of hollowing out. It is a vampiric leeching on the natural fullness of things. Today, I want to talk about 3 ways that we can recognize the ways of evil, and then 3 ways that we can inhabit the ways of goodness. So first of all, evil is privation. First way is that evil is bad habits, vampiric leeching on the fullness of things. So for me, in my life, the iconic evil habit from my late high school years to my early 30s was that I was an intermittent smoker of cigarettes, Camel Lights specifically. And they were iconically evil. Why? Because every single Camel Light cigarette is exactly the same. There's no variation. My cravings to smoke those cigarettes were exactly the same. They landed at the same place, the same time, and I went out and smoked them with the same people. And when I hit those cravings, I had to go do it. And then finally, it was increasing the chances that I would develop this evil thing that hollows out the inside of my body called cancer. Though, when you think of what is evil, think of that absolute identical repetition, the cravings that possess us, addictive, and this hollowing out even of our bodies, which is, in a way, its own kind of evil. So each of us, as part of the practice today, is going to identify an evil habit in our life, and we all have them. I'll share another one of my evil habits when I share with you what my practice is going to be. But you can see or get a sense of what these addictive evil habits might be in our lives. So that's one form of evil. Another form of evil is lying. In the Gospel of John, it says that the devil is the father of lies. Kierkegaard writes, in a very helpful summary, I think, in his journals, that lying is to denounce oneself, despise God, and fear our neighbors. Denounce yourself, despise God, fear our neighbors when we lie. Now, 2 additional things. One, Plato, in his Republic, I think convincingly argues that people who accumulate power, fame, and wealth through evil means, such as lying, are truly the most miserable people on earth. And as Christians, I would add, most to be pitied. To be good is to be happy. To be evil, including lying, is to ultimately be miserable. A second thing is one of my favorite books of the last 20 years, came out in 2005. It was written by a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, in the year before in an obscure academic journal, and it went viral, as we would now say. And the title of the article and then the title of the book was On Bullshit. And Frankfurt makes the argument that people who bullshit are worse than liars, because liars at least respect the truth enough to know that they are going against it, while bullshitters tend to get high on their own supply and believe that they are creating truth. It's a wonderful book. It's very short, it's very accessible, and it has one of the best last sentences of any book I've ever read. It heads towards this sentence, and it convincingly argues by the last sentence, sincerity is bullshit. And I believe that. And I want to give you a little teaser. One of my future classes that I would like to teach like this is going to be irony as Christian virtue. And I believe that to be true because of how insidious lying is, but also how insidious bullshit is. So lying as a second form of evil. A third kind of evil is dark thoughts. Now, I encourage you to read this week the first chapter, plus a couple of pages, of C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. It's in your packet. Perelandra was his favorite book that he ever wrote. It's the second book of a trilogy of scientifiction, he called it. He wrote it in the 1940s before they started calling it science fiction. He was trying to help it be called scientifiction. That didn't stick for obvious reasons. It's sort of awkward to say. So it is science fiction, just as Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a kind of fantasy. And in this second book, the narrator is leaving a train station, and he is walking for 3 miles towards the home of a friend of his named Ransom, who has had this adventure in the first book where he's gone off to Mars and encountered these spiritual creatures. And as the narrator is walking from for the 3 miles from the train station to Ransom's house, all of these doubts and concerns and fears start to emerge in his mind. And C.S. Lewis is marvelous in reproducing what it's like when we have doubts and resistances. It's so intense that at a certain point, the narrator says, despite the loathing and dismay that pulled me back and a sort of invisible wall of resistance that met me in the face, fighting for each step, he went forward. Now, when I read it, I think it sounds very familiar. Let me give you a specific example. I frequently have to park my car outside Marin General Hospital or Kaiser to go in and visit a parishioner who's sick in the hospital. And every time I do it, I swear, when I'm walking from my car to the hospital, I start having these ideas of like, God, I don't want to do this. You know what's in there? Sick people, sad people, machines that I don't understand, kind of cool, like every time. But I fight through it. But I've got those doubts, those thoughts, those things that pull me back from going and doing what I know to be the right thing. Well, in Perelandra, the second chapter begins when the narrator finally arrives at Ransom's house, and Ransom says to the narrator, "You got through the barrage without any damage?" It turns out the source of all those dark, doubting thoughts are these dark spirits, kind of devilkins. And Ransom says, the best plan to the narrator, the best plan is to take no notice and keep straight on. Don't try to answer them. They like dragging you into an interminable argument. Lewis wants us to entertain the possibility that our dark thoughts that start bubbling up in our minds, up to and including sheer despair, have a dark spiritual source. So that's evil. Goodness is creativity, non-identical repetition, and there are also 3 ways that we can understand this. First of all is the happy ability to vary the quotidian, the daily habits of life, so that they don't become dull, identical repetitions. We can be beautiful and creative. Here's my favorite contemporary theologian. I brought her up in the first session, Catherine Pickstock, commenting on how Kierkegaard has helped her understand how to fuse art and life together. And what Kierkegaard claims is that this is a female tendency. The female tendency, she writes, to dance through life as if separate art were a kind of hobby which men might tend to resort to. Therefore, woman, the natural virtuoso, quote, this is Kierkegaard, explains in the most interesting and beautiful manner the question that has cost many a philosopher his reason, time. I wonder if that's true. Kierkegaard goes on to suggest a female connection between his 2 paradigms for non-identical repetition, which is creative life, married life and liturgical life, and that's just historically true. And then finally, Pickstock says, the ethical then, as most realized by women, consists in the happy ability to vary the quotidian, to take delight in the subtle variations and continuity of day after day, shared with friends or with a marriage partner. Art and life can creatively meet in day-to-day life, and it is good. It is goodness. A second place where we encounter goodness in our day-to-day life is in humility. And this also is in your packet. There are a couple of sentences from Michael Casey's book, A Guide to Living, there's the gerund again, A Guide to Living in the Truth. And it's a guide to humility. 3 quotes from there. Casey says, in such a perspective, humility connotes a fundamental concordance with the reality of one's nature. Humility is living with the reality of one's nature, of who you really are. He quotes Bernard, the pursuit of empty things amounts to a contempt for the truth. And it is this contempt for the truth that causes our blindness. Empty things, not full things, not things as they actually are, not reality. And he writes, humility is above all a respect for the nature of things, a reluctance to force reality to conform to subjective factors in ourselves. So goodness, humility, is living in the real world, the world as it is actually given to us. And humility is the practice by which we are humus of the earth. This book, A Guide to Living in the Truth, is the one that inspired my first book, which many of you have bought, The Restoration Project. What are the practices that help us live in reality as it actually is? The very good reality that God has given to us as gift. Finally, the third practice of goodness centers around the preternatural. Now, the preternatural we sometimes use about athletes, preternatural skill that has incredible grace to it. But I'm using it in a slightly different sense. The preternatural is between the natural, which is the very good, scientifically measurable creation with more or less predictable laws, kind of like the universe. It's between the natural world and the sheerly supernatural world where Jesus walks on water and Moses divides the Red Sea and Peter instantly heals the person who is crippled in the book of Acts. The preternatural is proposed for our consideration by Abbot Chapman, the greatest English spiritual director of the early 20th century. His spiritual letters are an absolute classic, hugely formative for many of us in the Anglican and Roman Catholic traditions. He was a Benedictine monk and abbot. And he writes, and again this is in your packet, that the preternatural is a scanty and rare survival of that which was connatural to Adam, a survival of and Eve, a survival of powers of perception and translation, disused and atrophied by neglect, obscured and rendered invisible by our concentration on our natural powers, and yet emerging half-consciously in a few, and overpoweringly in a very few, but traceable in a good many. I believe actually traceable in every single human being, that we all have the capacity to perceive and inhabit a world that includes the preternatural, but that capacity has atrophied in us. I want to give you just two primary examples of the preternatural in Christian practice, I believe. One, baptism. Baptism, we say in the Episcopal Church, is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. What is that grace? Dying to ourselves and being reborn in Christ such that we are a member of a new family. We are a member of the body of Christ. Another example is the Eucharist, where the priest, and this is the case in the Lutheran and Anglican and Roman Catholic Church, stands up there with a piece of bread and says, "This is my body," says Jesus. And in those traditions, we believe that that's real, that this bread becomes Jesus' body, and that this wine becomes Jesus' blood. This isn't supernatural, but it's not natural. I'm holding up bread and saying it's body. That's weird. And it's also real and true. And I would suggest an invitation into understanding that the preternatural is part of what reality is. What if we took those sacraments and used them as an invitation to open our lives once again to spiritual realities that the world would rather smother in us? C.S. Lewis called modernity a, quote, evil enchantment that wishes to freeze over, like Narnia is frozen over, these latent but powerful powers of perception we each have, these powers of perception that are atrophied by neglect, as Abbot Chapman writes. There's a great Christian philosopher, Charles Taylor, and he calls it the difference between being a buffered self and a porous self. We can be classically Christian, porous to Thomas's cosmos, where we can say with the Nicene Creed, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. These unseen things include the corrupted vampiric leeches of the dark spirits that fuel our dark thoughts, and they include the mysterious change of bread into body and wine into blood, helping us remember that we are the body of Christ, porous to the world of spirit, both evil and good. Now, this week's practice, loving ourselves by nurturing two positive practices and allowing a negative practice, an evil practice, to wither. This is inspired by teaching that my sons, who are 20 and 22, got when they were in first grade at Wade Thomas, where they were taught a compliment sandwich. That if you have something hard you have to say to somebody, you say a nice thing to them first, then you give the hard truth, and then you follow up with another nice thing. So I want us to treat ourselves this way. So my good things this week are going to be, I find it life-giving to hike, and particularly these days I love to hike among trees. So I am going to go and hike 3 times among trees this week, because I know that that's a good life-giving thing. And the second life-giving thing is that I love, and I cannot understand who I am unless I meditate for at least 20 minutes every morning. And I'm doing that solidly. And it's even better when I also do it in the afternoon, and that often gets swallowed up. So my commitment this week is to do the afternoon 20-minute sit, because I know that gives me life. Here's my evil habit. I am addicted to online news. I check 12 different news sources every morning, and then sometimes I loop back to them 2 and 3 times during the day. Is this life-giving? No. It is me getting swallowed up by that intolerable abstraction, the public, being consumed by opinions that I have but do not own. So my commitment this week is my evil practice is to stop looking at internet news. So I'm going to read the IJ, which I actually get in a hard copy, which is kind of fun, and the New York Times on Sunday. And I do get a few emails, so I'll know the basics, but I don't need to repeatedly know everybody's opinions about the basics. So that's what's going to shrink in me, I hope, this week. So do you get what the practice is for loving ourselves, increasing 2 good habits, decreasing 1 evil habit? So that'll be the opening question next week. I also want to tell you now what the practice is going to be for the 5th and final class. Just the thing that you're going to share with other people, because I'm going to share with you my own experience of this next week. There's a journalist named Michelle Norris who she came up with this idea about a decade ago, where she left little postcards around cafes and various things like that that said, race, period, your thoughts, period, 6 words. And she thought she'd get a few dozen back. She got hundreds back. And what it revealed was that despite what people think, Americans are very hungry to have open, real conversation about race in their lives. So I want you to start thinking about what are your 6 words about your thoughts about race. I'm going to share mine with you next week. That's why I want you to start thinking about it now. And I will tell you that I found it really hard to come up with 6 words. 7 words I could do over and over again, but it took me a long while to come up with 6. And it's a wonderful, rich exercise. But for next week, the exercise is going to be your 2 good habits, your 1 bad habit. How did things go for you? Did you feel like you loved yourself in a new and slightly different way this week? All right, questions about, yes, Mike?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to this idea of goodness and creativity. I completely understand humility, a respect for the nature of things, and I feel comfortable with preternatural. But I see a tension between the two, because if you believe in the preternatural, then you're questioning the natural, or you're not necessarily respecting the natural nature of things, bread as a body.
Oh, that's an interesting observation. So how do you deal with both natural reality and preternatural reality? And it's not an either or, it's a both and, that both of these things are true. And what I'm trying to focus on in that first practice is the ability to just sort of stay in the moment and continue to enjoy the natural small variations of interactions with people that you love, of your coffee table in the morning when you have a different flour that arrives or a different jam that you're putting on your English muffin, and just staying alert and not falling into ruts so much that you're no longer paying attention and slowly hollowing yourself out. That helps a little bit. Bill, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the last reading you did touched on the unconscious, on the unseen. So how would you distinguish between the evil that resides in the conscious and evil that resides in the unconscious? Apparently evil doesn't just live in the conscious realm, apparently.
Well, I think what C.S. Lewis is pointing to is that I would bet that we all have streams of thoughts in our minds that add doubt, despair, fear, and to not get hooked by those thoughts, I think, is part of the practice, recognizing that they're there to hollow us out. And it can almost be a relief to realize that some of these thoughts are coming from places outside of ourselves and that have a spiritual source to them. And I think that's what C.S. Lewis is suggesting, is to beware. And I invite you to read that first chapter of Perelandra with the notion that these are dark thoughts, and see if you recognize some of those thoughts in yourself and can credit the fact that maybe some of them are coming from a source outside ourselves.
Just to follow up on that, I think that maybe 98% of the bad things that happen in the world come from the forces of the unconscious. We just simply don't know what we're doing. I mean, we're blind by, on the most superficial level, blind by bias. But the devil rides on the back of the righteous, I think. So beware when you're in a holy place.
Yeah.
So how do you associate that with evil? Am I right, maybe, that 98% of the bad originates from the unconscious?
I don't know the percentage. I just think that what C.S. Lewis is inviting us to think of is that thing we call the unconscious or the subconscious could have some dark spiritual forces that are part of what's going on, part of what's hollowing us out. Yes, Rose.
This is going to sound strange, but my best friend back east, I'm a bi-coastal kind of person. She doesn't return calls for 3 or 4 days, which is really unusual. You might think Rose is in her worry, anxiety mode, but I'm pretty sure it has to do with Trump winning the New Hampshire primary and the avoidance that maybe we're going to go visit that dark space. Is it maybe a goal to just take him off the discussion plate? That's not something I would do generally or inclined to do. But it triggers her. She's a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, despises that man and what he stands for, And frankly, it triggers her, so why would I want to hurt my friend? Bringing him up would necessarily hurt her, period. So would that be a practice, do you think, within the parameters?
Well, part of what so can everybody hear Rose's question? Part of why I want to teach this Transcending Contempt class now is because I do believe that the way our politics is functioning right now, and I'm not alone in thinking this, is more dehumanizing across the spectrum than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I don't think this is just nostalgia operating. I think we're all getting revved up and stimulated to be less human than we can be towards one another. And so I'm trying to encourage practices that enable us to treat people more like we were treating each other 20, 30 years ago as whole human beings, and be less caught up in these abstractions than we tend to be. This is part of the reason I'm wanting to cut myself off from all the internet news for a week and see if I can get back to a more human, whole place. So I think discretion around conversations while trust is being rebuilt is absolutely appropriate. Any other? Yes, Francis.
Well, and I would liken it to, when a wound is fresh, the last thing you want to do is sort of poke it.
Right.
So sometimes you need to step back and reestablish the broader picture, the okay, we are a safe relationship, and we are not the enemy of each other, and not shelf it forever, but step back from that conversation until, sometimes, for example, in a fight, you reach a point where you can't have a conversation. And to take a time out, which is the term parents use nowadays, can help people calm down and come back more rational. And maybe we just need to allow for the, okay, well, this is the calm down period.
Right.
And people are too ramped up to be able to think straight. And it can be very frustrating.
Yeah.
But because one person's going to reach that point of more calmness before the other.
Yeah.
That's just going to happen.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. A lot of it really is about timing and being in the right kind of a space. One of the reasons that I know that my long walks is a good thing is that I very often have to go through several drafts of anger and resentment before I arrive at something that's more magnanimous, right? That has a generous and strong heart, so that I can re-engage in a relationship and let go of some of the thoughts that would dehumanize the other or really dehumanize myself. It takes work.
To be right.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas it's generally, that both sides have some validity in their viewpoint, and it's, even if one side is right, it's really more often than not 80-20 or 90-10, that it's not 100% right and 100% wrong. There's something on both sides that is needing addressing.
Yeah. I used to co-lead premarital retreats with a marriage counselor, and one of his great lines always I thought was, you're going to reach a point in the argument with your spouse where you can either be right or you can be close. And I think that's kind of good advice for life. All right, well, we're, as usual, a few minutes over. So thank you all for sticking with us. Thank you all for those of you who joined on Zoom, and those of you who are seeing once again. We'll get the PDF up soon so that you can access these different readings and continue to participate in our seminar here in Transcending Contempt. Thank you, and hope to see you all next week.